Example 5 on page 433, closing costs of buying a home. If you've ever bought a home, at some point you have what's called the closing. At the closing, you show up and you sign a bunch of paperwork, so eventually the house becomes yours. But in the background of that closing are some financials going on. Things like down payments and closing costs and other costs, things that happen so that you can actually buy the house. All right, example 5 asks us to kind of delve into that a little bit. So it says, suppose you buy a house for $200,000. Your lender requires a 20% down payment and 2%, they call it points, at closing. Sometimes they call it percentage points, sometimes just points. You know, in the biz, they call it points. They might say 2 points at closing. And other closing costs are $4,076. This might be for inspections or just property fees. There's lots of costs that they throw in there. They always tell you what all those costs are, but if you've ever bought in a house, more than likely you're like me. It all becomes one blur at the end where they tell you what the costs are and you just go, and you kind of glaze over because there's so many of them. And varying degrees of different things. And, you know, I think at some point you end up signing your firstborn away anyway. So maybe today or tomorrow they'll actually be here for my son. I'll fight him tooth and nail because they can't have him. I like the kid and I'm going to keep him around. All right, so part A says, what is the deposit required? Well, they're telling us we need to put 20% down. So even though the house costs $200,000, our mortgage isn't going to be for $200,000. The bank is expecting us to put down 20%. So we need to know what 200,000 times 20% is. So let's start with that. So 200,000 times 20%. For us, again, we don't want to put 20% there. We're going to put down the decimal equivalent, which is 0.20. So let's bring our calculator up and calculate. 200,000 times 0.20. So it looks like $40,000 is going to be our down payment. So that's quite a bit of cash to bring to the closing. But that also means that the other half of this question, it says, what will our mortgage be? Well, our mortgage will be 200,000 minus 40,000. So our mortgage will only be for 160,000. So that's what the bank is going to loan us, is 160,000, because we're bringing 40,000. That seems kind of high to bring that amount of money, but if you've just sold a house and are buying a new house, a lot of times you do have some profit from the old house, and so that normally is what people bring and put down as a down payment. In this case, the bank is requiring a certain amount because they're only willing to loan you $160,000. That's why they're requiring this 20% down. Part B says, what do you pay in points? Well, unlike Part A, we're not paying points on $200,000. We're paying points on $160,000. So that's the nice thing here, is that instead of starting with $200,000, we're starting with $160,000. But it's still times a percent, in our case 2%. So times 0.02, no, not times 0.2. We've seen that here. That's 20. 0.02, that's going to give us the 2%. Let's bring our calculator up here once we get our dollar sign in, because we know it's going to be a dollar amount. We've got 160, 123, times 0.02. Looks like 3,200 is going to be our points that we need to pay. And then finally, part C asks us, what is the total amount that you must pay at closing? So when we show up at closing, they're going to expecting us to have a check that we can hand to them, or some sort of transfer, if it comes down to that, of a certain amount of money. Well, we know there's $40,000. We got to bring that. We know that there's $3,200 we got to bring for points. And we also know that there's other expenses here, $4,076 in other costs here. So now we just add all three of these up, and this will tell us the amount of money, so we can say it's money here, we need to bring to the closing. Let's bring our calculator up and see what we've got here. We've got the 40,000 plus the 3,200 plus the 4076 in other costs. So it tells us we need 47,276. That's kind of a lot of money. $47,276. Especially for a house that only costs $200,000. So that's a lot of things we're bringing there. We better make sure we have our act together if we're going to show up with this kind of money for the closing.